Hey there, welcome to the Life and Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Tegan, founder and CEO of Bright Arrow Coaching. In this show, we dive deep into how leaders like you can turn business challenges into personal growth opportunities. Whether you're a seasoned executive or an aspiring leader, this podcast is your go-to resource for unlocking your full potential in both your professional and personal life. Join me as we hear from executives, experts, and innovators about their leadership journeys and learn how to develop better strategies and activate them for success. So if you're ready to fuel your journey to becoming an extraordinary leader who makes a lasting impact, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. I'm excited to introduce today's distinguished guest, Dr. Russell Robinson. Dr. Robinson is a luminary in leadership and esteemed educator with American University's School of Public Administration and a forward-thinking consultant. His profound understanding of modern leadership challenges, particularly in the context of our post-pandemic and politically polarized world, positions him as a vital voice in our ongoing dialogue about effective leadership. Dr. Robinson has dedicated his career to redefining leadership as being more than just a role, but a dynamic catalyst for organizational culture and performance. In this episode, he will articulate that perspective on the obsolescence of outdated leadership tools and the indispensable trifecta of curiosity, confidence, and availability for today's leaders. We explore the changing dynamics of the workplace in the aftermath of George Floyd, COVID-19, and the significant shifts in generational expectations. If you're eager to cultivate emotional intelligence, foster an inclusive voice culture, and navigate the complex tapestry of modern leadership, then I assure you this conversation will be profoundly insightful for you. Here's Dr. Russell Robinson. Russell Robinson, welcome to the podcast.
Tegan, happy snow day to you, since we're both dealing with snow right now. Excited and honored to be a guest on the Life and Leadership Podcast.
I'm excited for our listeners today because in our prep call, we went deep, fast, and everyone who listens to podcasts knows the rapport between the two people chatting is everything. And I left our initial call just really excited, and I hope our listeners will feel that today too. So speaking of that prep call that we had for this podcast, I want to read a quote to our listeners, which you opened with in our very first conversation, and I'm smiling really big as I say that because I was like, oh, Russell is not here to play. We have real stuff to discuss. And here's the quote that I grabbed from you. I am worried about leadership development right now. In a post-pandemic, post-George Floyd, and in a polarized political world, we have leaders who are utilizing tools in a toolkit to lead that worked 10 to 15 years ago, and they don't work now. Hi. Powerful quote. Russell, I'm curious where you might start in terms of talking about what are we still trying to use that's outdated? And feel free, let's just start weaving in the where we need to go from there, So let's talk about that toolkit and break it down a little bit.
Right. So I think I'm going to start with my core values, right? So I have 3 core values that drive me: curiosity, confidence, and availability. Let's start with the last one first, availability. I think in a world where people are burnt out, stressed, and even before COVID, people had a lack of bandwidth to actually say, I am here. I'm going to make myself available to you so that you can feel seen, heard, and valued is magical. Confidence, I'm 55. My first leadership transition where it's I really started to get it didn't happen in the workplace. It happened the 7 years I was a U5 to U12 soccer coach. And what I found when you're dealing with kids to preteens and subsequently works in the workplace, confident people perform better. Yeah. Right? There's research on that. But let's get to curiosity. I think we need curious, learning leaders where the focus is not on what is the right answer, but what is the right question. Because when you focus on what is the right question, then you're always going to want to learn. You're always going to want to evolve. You're going to say what works now actually may not work in the future. So bringing it back to the quote, if you look at what we've got going on right now, a really polarized political world where 50% of the country feels one way, 50% of the country feels the other way. The world has become flat now, where there's so many avenues through social media where you can live in an echo chamber.
Yeah.
It's not like when I was a kid and there were like 3 channels and there was some middle of the road, some lean left and right, but there was some middle of the road. You have these differing perspectives, right? When I entered the work world in 1992, as a Black man, there was an aspect to whatever I felt, and that was around the time of Rodney King, that I was going to need to check that at the door when I got to work. And I think what we're finding now, post George Floyd, if I even go back to the massage parlor killings in Atlanta, that's when I worked in the government and I talked to my Asian American employees, and they were just talking about, it's hard for me to focus on work. So people are bringing this into the workplace. And, you know, the hot topic right now is whether we do return to work, a hybrid. When I teach my students here at American University, I'm very big that when I entered the workforce, you went to work.
Right.
And if you were lucky, you had a big, slow CPU, pre-dial-up. But now the work can come to you. You can hire anywhere. And maybe there's a hybrid balance. And where I get with all of this is each of those instances are going to require a different set of skill sets in your leadership toolkit. So if you're saying in 2025, I'm solely relying on what I learned in leadership 2015 and before, I think you're setting yourself up for individual, organizational, and operational challenges.
Yeah. Well, my friend, I will agree with you on that. What resonated huge for me is going back to your comment of, I'm paraphrasing, but the power of asking the question over having the answer. And there's a huge piece that comes up for me. One, our entire value proposition as a company is that we try to help leaders become coaches and self-coaching. And in our team framework, we teach the team to coach itself. So we are like, big thumbs up to you in agreement on, the power is in the question. And then I think the second thing that comes up for me when you say that is this world is so ambiguous and moving so fast that to assume there is a single right answer is so dumb, right? You know?
Yeah.
And so being able to ask the question that elicits all the potential answers is where the power is, especially when, to your point, we're just inundated with information. We're kind of inundated with options. So I just really appreciate you calling that forward right here at the top of our conversation. I think the question's everything.
It goes a couple ways, right? So on one hand, and I go where leadership development has to change, if you have spent 15, 20 years as a leader and you've been trained, promoted, paid well, bonused well on always having the answer.
Yes.
That's a huge transition to say, I want the question, right? Second thing I would say is, let's go back to right before we recorded, right? We talked about snow and you've got a 5-year-old daughter and the fascination with why, right? And kids have a different perspective. Last year, my student age range was 18 to 63. So I can see where they're alike. I also see that these Gen Zs have been raised different and they've been raised to understand that they have voice, they have agency, they have curiosity. If I tap that down as a leader and diminish this, or we talk about you with Afina, and when she's asking why, you are tapping that down. Well, because I said so. And you continue with that role, like their perspective of things is totally different, right? I had a friend who has his own business. This is back when I coached soccer. And he was like, hey, I'm trying to get my son to understand, like, I was the first person in my family to go to college. I was the first Black person at this high school. He doesn't understand X, Y, and Z. Our kids are the same age. I can't get my son to understand there was a world with just dial-up connection, right? Where only one person could be on, but they have different perspectives. So it goes back to this leadership aspect of asking questions gets to being curious. It also means being comfortable if you're wrong, right? I used to tell my team, you can call me anything you want as long as you bring me data, right? If you've got data to back it up. And I started with values. And when I teach, I say, hey, look, I hold my values very tight to me, right? Where I work, who I engage with, there has to be a value alignment. My beliefs, not so much. My beliefs are based on data. And if you come at me with data and I know how to ask those catalytic questions that spark curiosity, and we've created this psychological safety where you can be comfortable to take risks. You can be comfortable to be incorrect. You can be comfortable to tell me I am incorrect. Then you're getting into the magical thing. We're at an individual level, an organizational level. I saw you had my good friend Maggie Go on, right? For an episode. Then you get into this mental health and wellness space at an individual and an organizational level. And the upsides of that are fantastic. And it goes back to the original question. Nobody was focusing on this 10 or 11 years ago at this degree.
Man, the thing I want to normalize for this intergenerational work, as I hear you talking, is that the young Gen Z, I'm going to use hopefully the correct language here to say, our more senior generations, our younger generations have been raised with some of the values they have and the level of consciousness they have because our older generations felt oppressed not having it. It didn't come from nowhere. So I think it's so interesting to watch this rub now at work where our younger generations are saying, but why? Why are we doing this? How does it connect to a broader purpose? How does it connect to my purpose? In some ways, we inspired that. We're not going to take credit for all their hard work, but something about how we lived our lives has inspired that for them. So how do we then embrace it and let it enrich our lives and not take it personally? That command and control leadership is because I said so. And that way of leading is retiring so fast. It's interesting to think that we are connected as more senior generations with the reason they're asking that question, but yet we're confronted when they ask us why and what's the purpose. So it's really a fascinating dichotomy, I think,
I think, again, if you're curious, I'm big on voice culture, right? How do we create the space where everybody has a voice? So with the Gen Zs and the millennials, you can get into this context of, I need to see and hear you and how you are experiencing the world, right? How are you sense making the world? I mean, for all the things where we're different, we're alike, for all generations, people want to feel valued. They want to feel a sense of connection. They want to feel like they're respected. They want to feel like they are heard. They want to feel like there is alignment between what they do and the mission of the company and the organization. And as a Gen Xer, when I talk to my students, and I got 3 kids, 33, 31, and 24. When I talk to my 24-year-old, the big conversation is, hey, at the end of the day, the world is about results, how you perform, but more importantly, how you build relationships. And with students who come to school and they believe if I just study real hard, I'll get a great job and my career will go fantastically on this great path upward. And it's me to say, hey, like here, you have your context. Let me give you my experience. In your entire lifetime, I've had 4 jobs. Each job, when I got into the address of the interview, my ability to perform was what got me the job. What got me the address where the interview was a previous relationship with somebody. Here's how you focus on results and relationships. There's also this aspect of life will take you in different directions. This idea that you're going to get a degree, get a job, get married. That's your only marriage. And you're married to the perfect person. And there are no health challenges. And you're going to have kids. And when friends and family members die, it's in the proper order. That's not the way life is.
That's
life comes at you fast. So when you spark this curiosity and you focus on resilience, and that's where I say we have the context because we have experience. And then you bring it back to them and say, hey, look, this is what adulting is. It's research. You gather your data, you do your due diligence, and then you make a decision. And it may work and it may not work. I think there's a voice, there's an aspect of context. And that being said, while I'm Gen Xers, we have baby boomers in the world who may think life is moving really fast. I have value. I don't want to be ignored. And while the technology has changed and things are happening a lot quicker and the world is a lot faster, at the end of the day, it goes back to, have you built relationships with people? And that's older. That goes back to like official formal leadership training. Right? Leadership training really started in the early 1900s. We're in the States, but the relationship of where we became as a country goes back to pre-1700s. So the power of relationships, that's the things we can share. As long as people know you have a culture or relationships where people know that they can be heard, they can be valued, they can be considered, that's how you set things up for wins and positivity.
That brings me to the voice culture conversation. I'm using air quotes when I say voice culture. It's a phrase that you use to describe an ideal state for employees to be able to be expressed. So how would you define that for listeners, and why is that important?
Yeah, so a voice culture, like let me put on my Dr. Russ hat, right?
Yes.
So what I would probably say, pre-COVID, pre-George Floyd, that voice would be an employees, we'll say in the workplace, and employees having thoughts, ideas, concerns about the organization or the workplace, and them feeling that they can articulate that to their leadership or a change agent, and it can be heard or valued. Post-George Floyd, I would say all of that and include how employees feel about their mental health and well-being, right? And I think there's work from the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, on mental health and well-being, that one of the goals is to get to worker voice, where you capture all of that. Now, what that means is, let me jump into my leadership hat. When I'm hearing things from employees, that means I'm going to hear it. That doesn't mean I'm going to do it. And, let's go for like something simple like a pulse survey, right? A pulse survey says, in regards to the return to work, we want 3 things, A, B, or C. As a leader, I've heard it, I've listened to it, I've asked follow-up, and I say, hey, we can do A, we can do B, but we can't do C. And here's why we can't do C, right? But you're heard.
It's acknowledgement, right? The power of acknowledging.
Right. But if it's a thing where it's just a check the box exercise, like they're not going to act on it, then I'm not going to share my information with you. The biggest reason why people do not share their thoughts, ideas, concerns, or how they feel about their wellness is because they feel that there will be an adverse or negative impact to their career. And that's where I go back to where I said earlier about when you have curiosity, then we've created this space where if I'm the leader, you can disagree with me. I've worked in situations where we actually had an organizational value of curiosity. And every employee knew that if you were curious around the CFO, that was the end of your career. He just wanted you to do whatever he was told.
Yep.
And where that works to organizational impact, Tegan, is, let's say I'm the CEO. You coach CEOs, right? CEO, 500 employees. So let's say Maggie is our frontline action officer. I'm the CEO, and there are 5 layers between us. She's interacting with our customers in a way where she's getting information I don't.
That's right.
So a customer could be unhappy, or they could be like, you're zigging instead of zagging, or something that we're doing is maybe like, check the box. The customer's like, that's great. Have we created a culture where she can articulate that up the chain? Because in the end, I started with employee voice, but it is also this aspect of how do we give our customers voice where they can be heard. I'm in an academic setting, so I do student voice, and a lot of research on student voice gets to, we want to empower our students to exercise agency out in the world after they have a degree. I bring it into the class place. Okay, chapter 8, we've got these 4 topics. Here's a quick pulse survey. Let me know which one you want to do a deep dive on. So I think when you do that, and it gets to having curious people, not just training it. A lot of what we have, it really gets to, this is part of talent management. Are we hiring, training, and promoting the people who do this type of work? And here's the impact you have.
Right.
We're in a world where DEI has been weaponized. But when you focus on a voice culture, then for me, my goal as a leader is, I want to give everybody a voice. I want to make sure that in this scenario, who has the marginalized voice and making sure that they can be heard. So when you focus on a voice culture as a byproduct, and let's be clear, if you have a value of respect and curiosity and innovation, then by default, you should be embodying a voice culture.
Right.
But when you have a strong voice culture, then diversity is a byproduct. Organizational and individual mental health and well-being is a byproduct. Customer service is a byproduct. Performance is a byproduct. Creating a strong talent management and strong culture are byproducts. But again, you have to have leaders who care. And, sometimes one of my good friends said, if you can't change the people, you have to change the people. You have to have leaders who care.
That's right.
And then you have to have leaders who want what they say they want, right? Because what that means is if I'm a new leader and I've got a senior leader who doesn't model this voice culture and I've articulated a voice culture, then that gets to a difficult conversation. Because if I don't ensure that top up to top down, that we're embodying this espoused philosophy, then odds are you're not going to align to your values. You're not going to align to a culture. And if that's the way you want to go, then you got to be prepared to have a huge pipeline of potential customers because you're going to lose customers.
That's
you
right.
You have to have a huge pipeline of talent because you're going to lose talent.
I'm going to pull a thread out of that. So here we go. And employee engagement. You mentioned how it's been weaponized. At the time of us recording this, I'm not sure there's a hotter topic other than return to work being probably equally hot. If you're listening to this podcast and you're already feeling triggered about the DEI topic, keep your heart open. Russell, I'd like to hear your thoughts on where we are with that and its impact on employee culture.
Yeah. So the challenge, gosh, you could go a few different directions with DEI, right? And I could wear a few different hats. Before I started teaching at American, I worked in the government doing training and development. And my challenge with the DEI practitioners is like, is there any impact to what you're doing? Or better yet, how do you define it?
Which again, great question that leaders are still asking today. So thanks for coming with that.
Or if you're in intersectionality, can you define intersectionality without referencing Kimberly Crenshaw? Now, if they say, who is Kimberly Crenshaw, then it's like, well, maybe you need to stay in the lane you're in, right? For me, to make it simple, I believe your workforce should look like your customer base, the regions where you operate, and your industry. That's your workforce. Your leadership should look like your workforce. So, I live in Washington, D.C. So a lot of government vendors come to Washington, D.C. without realizing a lot of your customer base are going to be Black people from an Asian aspect, Filipinos and Filipinas, from a Latino perspective, El Salvadorans and Guatemalans, right? And then, as a sidebar, not all ethnicities are a monolith. So that's probably a different answer to a different question. So I need to make sure that my workforce looks like my customer base. When I worked in the government, I was doing training and delivery. I wanted to make sure that every employee could see themselves in the trainer to the point where when I would look at my vendors, I'd be like, hey, look, I got enough Black trainers. I got enough white trainers. I got enough LGBTQ trainers. I need Hispanic trainers. I need South Asian trainers. I need Asian trainers. I want everybody in my workforce to see a trainer who looks like them. Why? Because on one hand, people love to learn and align and see the end state to be people who look like them, who came where they came from and experience life as they experience. The next aspect of is if you want to grow your country, you have to have that. But then you have to have people who don't look like you, people who didn't come from where you come from and who didn't experience what you experienced. So employee engagement is my thing with employee voice. And there's an article from 1990 by Bill Kahn, which is like on the academic side, like that's the seminal work, right? And 4 years ago in 2020, there was a lot of 30-year stuff with him. And he said, hey, look, I never intended for employee engagement to turn into this survey and consulting business. But I went back and read the original article. And in the future research, he said, this research that I've started to do is very westernized and middle to upper income white people. Future research should bring other groups in, other demographics in. I have a really good friend who I was on her dissertation panel, and it looked at employee engagement in Middle Eastern banks, because what we found was how they experience the world is different.
Yeah.
Where their similarity is a lot of the engagement that got them through COVID was spirituality based, which would be the same, but you're talking about different religions. So it's different. So that would get to me as a leader. We just came from the holidays, right? So we focused on Christmas. We focused on Hanukkah. But if I have Muslim employees, I need to do some research on Ramadan so that we are making people feel seen, heard, and valued. And that's the case for diversity. And the last thing I would say is, I I had a gentleman by the name of Dwight Daniel, who's in charge of small business at NASA. And he said, with today's technology and what we're trying to do at NASA, we're trying to get a man on Mars, I think before the end of this decade. The big normal vendors, they're not as agile as the smaller businesses. That's why we may need to bring them in. And then we start to look at our vendors as partners. So again, if you go into that depth, then you've made the case for diversity.
Yeah.
I think from a political standpoint, you have to say where we're talking about the weaponization, there's a group of people who feel diversity is a threat to them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know if I agree with it. I know my friends who have that view. We can sit and chat because I may get a new perspective,
Mm-hmm.
or I may see something where it's like, how do we, as we implement this diversity policy in play, how am I making sure that the white men in my workforce are seeing there's a benefit to them or benefit to the organization and them? And if they have fears, that again, I've created a space where they can bring their voice and put it out.
Right.
To sum it up, it's been very narrowly focused on all sides.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I just don't know what the impact is.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting 18 months, if I had to guess, of seeing, what some of the bigger organizations choose to do or not do.
But it gets to a pendulum, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at post-George Floyd, the pendulum swung one way, return to work. When everybody was, we're going to all work from home, the pendulum swung one way.
Right.
And eventually it's going to move back to the center.
Yes.
But you need to have leaders that are prepared for all of that, who have created this space from a voice culture standpoint where they know where their workforce is.
Yeah.
And that also gets into like succession planning. Because if I'm doing return to work and I say everybody has to be in the office, I got some employees who'll be like, cool, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
I got employees who may like, that's not what I want.
Yeah.
If I've created, you have my guy, Jason Lauritsen up there.
Mm-hmm.
Easiest way to do a voice culture is a check-in. If I'm doing check-ins, then I'm going to know where my employees are as these policies come down.
Yeah.
And then I can do succession planning.
Yeah. We'll be sure to bring back Maggie Goff's interview and Jason Lauritsen's interviews in our show notes too. Listeners can kind of tack back to what Russell's talking about there. The other thing you mentioned that I'll reconnect now to this part of our conversation, Russell, is when we do in the voice culture ask for the feedback, especially now when we're talking about the topic of DE&I, if there's things we're going to do and not do, we must at least acknowledge what we heard. And that's going to take some courage for some organizations who may choose to do the unpopular thing, who may choose to do the opposite of what employees have asked. But the power is really in, we heard you and here's what we heard. Here's our decision and here's why. And you mentioned that earlier, but I want to reconnect that now to this conversation because this topic is right here, right now. And it's going to be in front of us for quite a while longer, as it should be. And hopefully we continue to do what's in the best interests of the organization and the people, because the two are not really separate, as we know from the data. So it's going to be a really interesting couple of years on that front. The other thing is mentioning the pendulum. So one of the things about pendulums, isn't it true scientifically that they exist? But sometimes our margins get a little broader, which is good. So the center is not the center it was before.
I think the key is whether you think your organizational pendulum is swung too far one direction with DEI or return to work. If you're doing a voice culture, and I think the challenge with what we're seeing right now is an external stakeholder is putting pressure on organizations and then they're acting, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm a CEO, I think we need to have return to work. Then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slow down, right? I think too many times organizations and leaders make quick decisions when a slower decision may be better. And if it's return to work or you're altering DEI or any other major policy, then I think there's value in taking time to say who are all the stakeholders, right? If I'm a publicly traded company, who's my board of directors? Who are my customers? Who are my employees? Who's my union, if my union's involved? Who are my suppliers? And let's bring all this data in. And you make it to the point where like, this is not unanimous. This may not even be consensus.
Yeah.
I need to gather all of this data And then based on the data, I can make a decision. And then that says, okay, if I'm operating, I won't use Black people. If I'm operating in the Bay Area where there are a lot of Asian people and I'm coming up with a DEI model that may not be important to them, then how am I going to communicate it? Then I'm going to look at my team and say, if you're doing check-ins and you created this voice culture, who's going to stay, who's going to go, so that we can succession plan. I think with return to work, a lot of times there are differing perspectives, right? I live in Washington, D.C. It's a heavy government town, but there are also mom and pop businesses near federal agencies that their lifeblood is federal employees. My cleaners where I am during COVID, they got no business because people were not going to work.
Right.
So if you're going to bring employees in, there's going to be an upside, a downside, downside ripple effect. If you keep everybody at home, there's going to be an upside, downside ripple effect. I think the question is, how do you address all of that in your decision making?
Yeah.
And again, I think the challenge we have right now is there was this rush to send everybody to 100% remote work. And now there's a rush to bring people in. There was a rush to move DEI to DEI, and now there's a rush to move away from it without understanding the impact that it's going to have on the workforce and also the customers.
Well, you are queuing me up to ask you about the next thing I want to chat about with you, which is a complex problem. So you and I talked earlier offline privately about what are we solving and what does it really take to solve it? And I think the topics we just mentioned are great examples of complex problems, but talk a bit about that in your leadership development work, what you're seeing and what listeners should really be thinking about when it comes to this topic.
So a complex problem, to me, is a problem where there is no answer. Let me put my teaching hat on. There's a book by Jennifer Garvey Berger called Simple Habits for Complex Times. Great book.
Check that out. I haven't heard of that one. Thank you.
Right. So it breaks problems into 5 parts, right? They're simple, complicated, complex, and chaos, and disorder. So let's get the easy one out the way. For disorder, there's no plan. You saw Independence Day, right? So if Earth gets invaded by aliens, right, there's no plan for that. I think we have leaders who are built to solve simple and complex problems. A simple problem is something where I know what the answer is. So if, for example, I haven't traveled since COVID and now I have to travel, odds are my whatever travel software you're using, my password has expired. I need a new password. That's real simple. In the old days, you would call somebody. Now you can, with AI and technology, you can reset your link. Really simple. Simple. Complicated problem. I don't know the answer, but someone on my team does. Or perfect example, you're driving, your engine light comes on, you have no idea what's going on. You go to the car dealer, they get it to the mechanic, the expert, they run a diagnostic. Mr. Travato, here's your problem. You can do A, B, or C. That's what leadership's based on. There's always an answer. When there isn't an answer, how do you, if I'm a leader, where everything about leadership is based on employees going to the workplace, and it's a generation of workers that look like me, and they're my age and my experience. And now we have to create a new model with a much more diverse group of employees, different generations, and people technically don't have to go into the office. The work can come to them. Well, that's something new, right? There is no answer to that. And chaos is the perfect case for command and control because you need to stop what's going on, right? The building's on fire. I don't have time. Hey, Tegan, what do you think's the best thing? No, you get out. But when you have complex, well, command and control doesn't work. And what we have found is, and it goes back to our original question, if you rely on your skill sets to answer a question that worked 10 years ago now, that actually may make it worse. So what we found is, okay, how do you ask questions? How do you seek multiple perspectives? And how do you see these things as a system? And the one thing I would also say is, I think when I work with leaders, there is this belief that urgent problems require urgent solutions. And in actuality, urgent problems require patient solutions, right? If it's not chaotic, if a building's not going to collapse and somebody's not going to die, there is always time. I'm an NBA fan, and I can't remember the game, but last year there was a game in the playoffs. A team was down by 1 with 3.7 seconds left, right? That's not a lot of time. and they threw it into a guy. He just caught it and shot the ball and missed. And the announcer's like, there was time. He could have dribbled a couple times. He could have made a pass. Yeah. So even when you think there isn't time, there is time. So how do we get to a point where we are making patient decisions? We're doing our due diligence. My tech skills are not good. So if I know I have a look at a technology software or something, I got to bring my CTO in. I got to bring the technological expert in because they're going to ask the questions I didn't think about.
Right.
Or I'm going to see the ripple effect of systems, right? And I go back to return to work. If you decide on a whim that we are going to bring everybody back into the workplace. When I worked in government, we did an engagement survey and a pulse survey. And what we found was work-life balance and recognition were the biggest drivers of engagement. So if we make a move that says everybody must return to the office, then we know that's going to have an adverse impact on work-life balance. What's the ripple effect of that? Now, I had a friend whose company did a return to work solely because they had rented out more office space. And the CEO felt like we need to utilize the space. That's a good perspective. That needs to be factored in. But if you see things as a system, then you understand the impact. So let's make it simple to what you do, right, at Bright Arrow. And what I have always felt is that executive coaching is really good for a leader with a problem. It's not good for a problem leader, right? It's not.
That's very well said. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
It's not the antibiotic for a bad leader. Or let's bring it to diversity, right? There are a lot of companies that feel like, oh, wow, we just need to offer unconscious bias training. Mm-hmm. And sometimes 10% of the time that may work. And those are the cases they celebrate. But you're a woman, right? So the cool thing is when I talk to women leaders about this, it's like there's something where maybe a guy, an older generation, may refer to you in a way that he thinks is affectionate. Mm-hmm. And you may be like, that really grates me. But we've created a culture. So like when I got this office, our associate director, I was like, it's fine. It looked like a dorm room, right? Mm-hmm. No, I really think we should do something. And one Friday when I was out, they really tightened it up. And the next week I was like, yeah, man, she gave it a woman's touch. And the third time I said it, she was like, I also gave it a professional touch. I was like, oh, wow. Okay, that's my bad, right? Mm-hmm. But we had built a relationship where she could be like, he doesn't mean anything by it. I can articulate my voice to him.
And let him know my preference.
But as a woman, I think there may be times in the workforce where you have dealt with predators, and that's a hiring issue. That's not an unconscious bias issue. Mm-hmm. So you really have to see these things really as a system to really understand if we're not asking the right questions, then if we have a predator in the workplace, then the typical answer of unconscious bias training actually is going to make that situation worse, as opposed to asking the right questions, finding out what the real problem is, and coming back with a solution that works. Mm-hmm. But that takes time. That means creating a voice culture. That means giving everybody a perspective. Yeah. And that's where I go back to, those are different types of tools that need to be in a leader's toolkit.
Yes. Oh, this is so rich. And, I'm going to go back a few minutes to pull out one thing, just to acknowledge it, that I loved so much. I will be using this with my clients here forward. The value of pacing over agility. We have over-indexed to the urgent. I just really appreciate that call out, Russell, because we work with senior executive teams. They are the ones who set the pace. So if they think everything's on fire, it's on fire for everybody. But potentially challenge where we can that pacing has its equal value to agility, because we have glorified agility in the executive space, as you know, in the org dev space. I'm just excited about that one, nerdily excited about our opportunity to bring that up in our next session or two with clients, to have them really weigh the value of like, what is more valuable here, a paced decision with data or an agile decision with risk? And we forget that we have the former option a lot. And that is really coming up for me, thanks to you. So thanks.
There's always time, right? And if you're hiring, and you learn this the hard way, you never rush to make a good hire, because bad hires are stuck with you forever, right? excuse my French, in my organization, I would rather have a hole than an asshole, right? It really gets to understanding what time is. And again, if nobody is going to die, if a building is not going to collapse, there is always time. And when you have a patient decision, then you always have the opportunity to bring stakeholders in. I remember I was working with a client to do organizational cultures. Chief Human Resource Officer was like, it was culture, but we started with org values. Chief Human Resource Officer was like, I like new values and I like to have them in a month. And we went back and we said, what if we gave them to you in 3 months? And in that time, we're going to create these touch points to the workforce, roll some out, we'll survey. In addition, when we give you the values, we'll give you the values. We'll define the values. And then we'll give you examples of the behavior that gets rewarded or held accountable. And it worked great. We put together a team that worked. We were going to come up with 5 values because I'm really big on there shouldn't be more than 5 values. But we came up with initial 10 and polled the workplace employees, right? So now they have ownership in this. And what you found was by taking 2 months longer, you had less resistance. You were then able to come up with ways that you can implement it into how you recognize employees, right? We've identified the behavior. How do we recognize Tegan for what she did, but also include those values in it? So I think with leaders, and again, we're in this world where everything needs to happen right now. Actually, it doesn't, right? When you get frustrated and somebody sends you something, it's like, oh, I'm going to fire off a response right now. And it's like, no, I actually got time. Okay, let me walk around. Let me think about it. Let me ruminate on what they said, but there's always time. And I think a segue is as an employee or as a person on the soccer team, as a person in a relationship. We started off, before we started recording, talking about your daughter and my kids. Everybody has agency. So how do you understand that you have agency? Even when you're disengaged, even when you're in a bad spot, you have agency. And if you're a leader, how do you make sure that everybody who has agency has voice and that they are heard? I think you're setting yourself up for wins at an individual and organizational levels.
Well, just to add a little humor, I'm going to ask our listeners to use a soundbite from Russell's last few minutes here in your next talent development planning session or your next continuity planning session. I'd rather have a hole in my org chart than an asshole. If you manage to use that quote, email Russell and I will send you a gift. There's just so much power in saying, let's not force something into this seat that's not right for us.
She's going to send you an Emerald air fryer, man. Those things are magical.
Well, Russell, one last piece as we're concluding today. I'm curious about the EQ work you're doing with your first year students. Can you tell our listeners about that a bit?
Yeah, so a little bit about what I do. I teach at American University, teach leadership, public admin, master's level, MPA, Master's in Public Administration, to our government employees, also our regular students, certificate programs to our government employees. And it's really, our government program is based on turning ordinary managers into extraordinary leaders. And we decided to replicate that and turn it into a leadership certificate program for undergraduates. And I'm fascinated by it. Looking at within schools of public administration, we're the only ones in the top 25 that are doing this at an undergraduate level. Because what we find is it's never too early to start focusing on training leadership. When I sum up to what we're doing, we're creating more emotionally intelligent leaders. For listeners, if you close your eyes, think about your best work experience. Think about your worst work experience. The data says the biggest determinant of a good work experience and a bad work experience is a relationship with your direct supervisor. The data also says leaders with strong emotional intelligence create a better work experience than leaders with low emotional intelligence. So let's start this when they're early in their learning journey. But these are 18-year-olds, right? So I got first generations, right, who've never got less than a 4.0, and then their first paper is a C, and they think the world's ending, right? So that gets to resilience. I've got students who come from small towns and now they're in Washington, D.C., and maybe it's a little too big for them. So our text work focuses on emotional intelligence as it relates to young adults and college students, because what we're starting to do is, what our goal is to start to build this leadership muscle now so that they understand emotional intelligence and they come up with a foundation of leadership. What are your core values, your definition of leadership, your non-negotiables? How do you react to when life goes sideways for you, right? When things do not go well. And what we're looking at is we build this foundation early. And none of these kids are I graduated in 4 years and I'm supervising 500. But if you have a job where all things are the same and it's a choice between working for Tegan and working for Russell, and you know what? I've asked questions where Russell really doesn't care about my voice and he's a micromanager. Tegan has talked about how I can be involved in the decision-making process. And the last 4 people who came in at this position were promoted to X, Y, and Z. Then the decision who to work for is a lot simpler. But if you start to build this muscle now and you start to build curiosity to curious people, let's go back to your daughter, Athena. If you fuel curiosity instead of tamping it down, then odds are you are going to create leaders who know how to deliver results, because they're going to know how to make strategic decisions because they know how to solve complex problems, and they know how to build relationships. And those are the type of people that organizations want to hire and people want to work for.
Yes. Oh, gosh. I'm so proud of your university for being early to market on this one. This is what we all need exposure to, arguably even earlier than college, but heck yes, to college. That's way earlier. I mean, if you think about it, we're doing some of that work with leaders who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and it's their first time. So to get them at 18 is going to change the world. That's how we change the world, right? Is that earlier access, early leader. Beautiful stuff, Russell.
So it's not just a one-to-one comparison, right? But if you go to a household where a child, your daughter's age or younger, are learning bilingual languages, the learning capacity is earlier as opposed to if they start to learn a second language at 15.
That's right.
If you bring all of this into people, curiosity, emotional intelligence, voice culture, before they get in this leadership journey, before they have been programmed that the way to get promoted is to always have always have to have the right answer, the benefits down the road are going to be exponential.
Yeah, huge ripple effects. So in conclusion today, my friend, if you were to imagine you have a mic, you've got an auditorium of thousands of senior leaders, as someone whose work is focused on developing leaders, what would you want them to know and go back to their practice with today?
Right. So I would ask them a question. Take how you felt about leadership in 2020, early 2020, because it's 2025 now. In the past 5 years, what have you read, learned, or experienced that has changed some aspect of how you view, espouse, or embody leadership?
You know, as a coach, I cannot get enough of that question. So what a lovely way to conclude us today. Russell, thank you so much for your wisdom and your friendship through this process. It's been so fun talking with you and even preparing for our time together. And thank you for the great work you're doing in the world. I know you know this, but I'll say it out loud. What you're doing changes generations, and that is worthy, purpose-oriented work. So thank you.
Thank you again, man. It's just an honor to be on the Life and Leadership podcast. You got a stellar group of people. So the fact that you asked me to share my little bit of knowledge, I'm honored by that. So same to you for the work that you're doing with Bright Arrow. We need better leaders badly. So anybody that's doing the work, I'm a fan of.
Awesome. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed my time with Dr. Robinson, and I hope you did too. His perspective on modern leadership really highlights how important it is to evolve and adapt to the challenges of our post-pandemic world. What really stuck with me was his focus on curiosity, confidence, and availability. It's such a powerful reminder that great leadership isn't about always having the answers. It's about creating a space where every voice is valued. The stories he shared, from embracing diverse perspectives to cultivating emotional intelligence, offer practical tools we can all use to navigate the complexities of today's workplace. I hope his ideas encourage you to take a closer look at your own leadership style. How can you nurture your curiosity, build your confidence, or be more present for your team? Dr. Robinson's insights remind us to lean into the unknown, appreciate different viewpoints, and prioritize open and honest communication. Together, we can create workplaces where people feel seen, heard, and truly valued. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Life and Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, I'd love it if you would subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube Music, and don't forget to share it with someone who might find it helpful.